There is a place in God where the soul no longer drifts, where the spirit is no longer asleep, and where faith ceases to be a theory and becomes a living force. And I tell you plainly that many desire power without change, many pray for visitation without preparation, and many want the Spirit to move while they themselves remain unmoved. But the kingdom of God does not respond to convenience. It responds to alignment. And when a man or woman makes daily shifts in how they think, how they believe, how they speak, and how they act, the Spirit opens like a door that has long been shut, and heaven finds room to enter. The first shift begins when you move from listening to truth into obeying truth, because light that is admired but not acted upon becomes darkness, and revelation that is celebrated but not lived becomes a weight upon the soul. And God never intended His word to decorate your mind, but to command your life. For the moment obedience replaces hesitation, the Spirit awakens and faith rises without effort. Many ask why they feel distant from God, yet they delay obedience, they postpone surrender, they negotiate with conviction. But the Spirit flows freely only where the will is yielded. And when you say yes before you understand, heaven responds before you explain, and suddenly the Spirit breathes again. The next daily shift comes when you move from emotional faith into settled belief. For faith is not a feeling, and power does not wait for excitement. And the Spirit of God does not move according to mood, but according to truth believed without wavering. And I tell you that doubt is not humility. It is disobedience disguised as caution, and fear is not wisdom. It is faith looking in the wrong direction. When belief becomes fixed, when the heart refuses to entertain unbelief, when the mind is disciplined to agree with God rather than circumstances, the Spirit opens wide and strength rises like a flood, and what once felt heavy becomes light, what once seemed impossible becomes expected, and the inner man stands upright again. Another shift must take place daily when you move from speaking about faith to speaking by faith, because words are carriers of either life or limitation, and many choke their spirit not by sin alone, but by careless speech, by repeated confession of weakness, by agreement with fear, by rehearsing defeat. And yet the Spirit moves swiftly where words are aligned with truth, where the tongue declares what God has said regardless of what is seen. And when a believer speaks as though God cannot fail, the Spirit responds with boldness and clarity. There is power in a mouth governed by faith, and silence in the face of doubt often speaks louder than shouting mixed with fear. And when you discipline your speech daily, the Spirit learns to rise rather than retreat. Then comes the shift from passive waiting to active expectation. For many wait on God as though He were reluctant, as though heaven were slow, as though power were scarce. Yet the Spirit is already willing, already present, already prepared to move, and it is the believer who must shift from hoping something happens to expecting something must happen, because expectation is faith standing at attention. And when expectation fills the heart, the Spirit becomes alert, sensitive, and responsive. God moves quickly where faith is awake, and there is no delay where there is no doubt. And when expectation becomes your daily posture, the inner man stops slumbering and begins to watch for God in every moment. Another shift that opens the Spirit is the movement from self-preservation to holy abandonment, because as long as a person guards their reputation, their comfort, and their control, the Spirit remains restrained, not because God withholds, but because He will not force what must be freely given. And when a believer dies daily to pride, to fear of man, to the need for approval, the Spirit rises into freedom, and boldness becomes natural rather than forced. Power flows through yielded vessels, not careful ones, and the Spirit moves where surrender is complete. And when you abandon yourself to God without reserve, heaven finds room to operate without resistance. Each of these shifts must happen daily, not once in a lifetime, because faith is not maintained by memory but by discipline, and the spirit does not remain open by accident but by intention, and every day the believer must choose obedience over convenience, belief over emotion, declaration over silence, expectation over delay, and surrender over safety. And when these choices become habitual, the spirit stays tender, alert, and alive, and God finds a vessel ready at all times. And I tell you that the spirit is not distant, power is not rare, and faith is not difficult when the inner man is properly aligned, and as the soul learns to agree with heaven, the spirit remains open, receptive, and strong, and the life of God flows without obstruction, producing courage where there was fear, clarity where there was confusion, authority where there was weakness, and the believer walks not striving for power but carrying it naturally as the breath within them, moving daily in alignment, walking daily in faith, and living daily from the place where the spirit is fully awake, and heaven is never shut out. And when the spirit remains awake, life no longer presses in with the same authority it once had, because pressure loses its voice where faith has found its footing, and the believer discovers that trials are no longer interruptions, but invitations to prove what is already settled within. And I tell you that God is not revealed in ease alone, but in resistance overcome by trust. And the spirit opens wider when it learns to stand firm without visible support. Many shrink in the face of opposition because they have trained their faith only for comfort, yet the spirit grows strong where endurance is practiced daily, and when the soul refuses to retreat at the first sign of difficulty, the inner man becomes unshakable, rooted not in circumstance, but in conviction. There is a daily strengthening that comes when a believer chooses praise over complaint, not because the situation has changed, but because faith refuses to bow to appearances, and praise spoken in pressure becomes a key that unlocks hidden reserves of spiritual strength. When the mouth blesses while the mind is tested, the spirit rises in authority, and heaven responds to that sound which carries trust rather than fear. As the days continue, another deepening occurs when the believer learns to separate identity from experience. For many measure their standing with God by how they feel or what they see, yet the Spirit bears witness to truth that does not fluctuate, and when a person believes they are accepted, empowered, and called regardless of performance, the spirit remains open and confident. Condemnation closes the inner man, but assurance unlocks boldness, and where assurance reigns, faith operates freely without hesitation. God moves most powerfully through those who are not striving to earn his approval, but are living from it. And when the heart rests in that certainty, the spirit ceases its striving and begins its reigning. There is also a refining shift that takes place when a believer stops asking God to remove every challenge and instead asks him to reveal his strength within it. For power is often hidden beneath pressure, and the Spirit brings it forth when the soul agrees with heaven rather than resists. Process. Weakness surrendered becomes a doorway for divine strength, and when a person ceases to defend their limitations and begins to trust God within them, the Spirit expands beyond former boundaries. God is not intimidated by human frailty, but he is restrained by human resistance, and when resistance is replaced by trust, the Spirit finds freedom to work without hindrance. As faith matures, the believer learns the daily discipline of stillness, not as passivity, but as attentiveness, for there is a listening posture that keeps the spirit sensitive and responsive. Noise dulls discernment, and hurried hearts often miss quiet instructions, yet the Spirit speaks with clarity where the soul has learned to be still without becoming idle. Stillness is not the absence of action, but the alignment of attention. And when the inner man learns to listen before moving, obedience becomes precise and effective. Many mistakes are born not from disobedience, but from impatience. And when patience becomes a daily companion, the spirit remains clear and undistracted. Another strengthening takes place when a believer learns to rejoice in unseen victories, for faith does not wait for evidence to celebrate, and joy rooted in promise rather than proof becomes a powerful expression of trust. The spirit delights in joy that is independent of outcome, and when the heart rejoices in advance, faith moves from hope into certainty. This joy is not shallow excitement but deep assurance, and it stabilizes the spirit even when circumstances fluctuate. Where joy abides, heaviness finds no resting place, and the inner man remains light, mobile, and responsive to God's leading. There is also the daily decision to guard the heart against bitterness, for resentment closes spiritual channels faster than weariness, and unforgiveness dulls sensitivity to the Spirit's voice. When a believer releases offenses quickly, choosing mercy over memory, the spirit remains uncluttered and free. Forgiveness is not weakness, but alignment, and it restores flow where blockage once existed. God moves easily through a heart that refuses to harbor resentment, and power operates unhindered where love remains unpolluted by offense. As days turn into seasons, the believer begins to recognize that spiritual authority grows in proportion to spiritual responsibility, and the Spirit entrusts more where faith has proven faithful in small matters. Authority is not seized but stewarded, and when a person honors God in unseen obedience, the Spirit becomes trusted territory for divine operation. God does not advertise his power through spectacle alone, but through consistency, and where faith is maintained in private, power manifests naturally in public. The inner man also grows strong when a believer learns to resist discouragement swiftly, for delay does not mean denial, and silence does not mean absence. The Spirit often works beneath the surface long before fruit appears, and those who remain steadfast during unseen seasons discover a depth of strength that cannot be shaken by timing. Patience is faith stretched across time, and when patience is embraced, the spirit remains open rather than strained. Many abandon trust too soon, yet those who endure without wavering find that strength multiplies quietly within. There is a daily sharpening that comes when the believer chooses truth over familiarity, for traditions that lack life must be released to make room for fresh obedience. The Spirit is living and active, and he does not move by habit but by truth embraced anew each day. When the heart remains teachable, the Spirit stays alive and flexible, able to move with God rather than lag behind him. Stagnation comes not from age, but from resistance to renewal, and where renewal is welcomed, vitality remains constant. As faith deepens, the believer learns that courage is not the absence of fear, but the refusal to obey it, and when fear is confronted daily with truth, the spirit gains resilience and clarity. Fear thrives in uncertainty, but faith anchors the soul in promise, and when promise becomes the reference point, fear loses its grip. The Spirit empowers bold obedience, not reckless action, and boldness grows where trust has been cultivated consistently. Every time fear is denied authority, faith gains ground, and the inner man becomes stronger and more decisive. The Spirit also opens wider when the believer understands that power flows through love, not control, and that influence grows where humility remains intact. Pride narrows spiritual capacity, but humility expands it, allowing the Spirit to move without obstruction. When a person chooses service over status, obedience over recognition, the Spirit becomes a clear channel for divine life. God entrusts influence to those who do not seek it for themselves, and where humility reigns, authority follows naturally. And as this life of daily alignment continues, the believer realizes that faith is not a momentary act, but a continual posture, and the Spirit remains open not by chance, but by choice, strengthened through obedience, steadied through belief, energized through expectation, and liberated through surrender, and the life of God flows freely through such a vessel, shaping thoughts, governing words, directing actions, and producing a life that carries heaven's imprint in every step, where power is not summoned but present, where the Spirit remains awake, responsive, and strong, moving forward without hesitation, walking daily in agreement with God, and living from that inward place where faith has fully taken root and nothing within resists the working of the Spirit. And so this life of daily shifting is not about striving to become something greater, but about removing everything that resists what God has already placed within you. For the Spirit was never meant to live half awake or confined by fear, doubt, or self-interest, but to stand fully alive, responsive, and yielded to the divine life that longs to flow without interruption. When these daily choices become the rhythm of your walk, faith ceases to be an effort and becomes your nature, obedience becomes your instinct, and power becomes your quiet companion rather than a distant pursuit. You no longer search for open heavens because you discover that heaven responds to an open spirit, and where the inner man remains aligned, God moves freely, decisively, and continuously. This is not reserved for a select few, nor granted by chance, but made available to every believer who will choose daily alignment over comfort, truth over feeling, surrender over control, until the Spirit stands fully open, fully yielded, and fully alive, carrying the unmistakable evidence of life lived in agreement with God.